What could hurt more than being humiliated by a close person in your own home? But every patience has its limit. Sometimes just 2 words are enough to put a brazen person in their place so firmly they forget about dignity, and even their boots. Enjoy the story. Brooke felt like a jeweler bent over the rarest diamond. Only instead of a gemstone, she had a duck. Not just any duck, but a dream bird, soaked in orange juice with thyme and rosemary, rubbed with a blend of Himalayan salt and 4 peppers, ready to go into a blazing oven and, 3 hours later, emerge as a culinary triumph. All day, from early morning, her kitchen had turned into an operating room where she, the chief surgeon, performed a sacred ritual. The oven timer counted down the minutes until the show began, and every click echoed in her temples like a tense alarm bell. This wasn't just dinner. It was her last attempt to sign a peace treaty. The air was thick and spicy, filled with the smell of baked apples, cinnamon, and something subtly festive. That very scent Brooke had worked so hard to create in the small but cozy 2-bedroom apartment she shared with Russell in a quiet Chicago neighborhood. The apartment, bought with a 25-year mortgage, was her fortress, her canvas. Every pillow on the couch, every photo frame on the wall had been chosen with love. Tonight, that fortress was preparing for a siege. "Brooke, I swear, everything will be different," Russell's voice echoed in her head. Yesterday's voice, confident, almost triumphant. I talked to her, and I was firm. I explained that it's our anniversary, that you matter to me, and if she wants her son to be happy, she has to stop these inspections of hers. Brooke had listened while sitting on the edge of the bed, nodding mechanically. She saw how proud he was of himself, how he'd finally hit the table, metaphorically at least. She knew what it had cost him. Vivian, his mother, was a woman of stone, a woman of tsunami force. A woman whose personality could have been the basis for a textbook on applied tyranny. She wanted to believe him. God, how she wanted to believe him. For that belief, for that fragile, almost ghostly hope of a truce, she had started all this. Not just a dinner, but a carefully staged performance. Not just salads, but 3 works of art. One with shrimp, avocado, and grapefruit. Another layered, with beef tongue and pickled mushrooms. The third, classic Olivier salad, but her own version, with quail eggs and crayfish tails, which Vivian had called a perversion of tradition a year ago. For dessert, a lemon tart made with almond flour, demanding 4 hours of attention and nearly devilish patience. She had invested more than just effort into this evening. She had poured in the last of her optimism, and almost $1,000. A noticeable sum for their family budget, where Russell's salary as a sales manager and her freelance designer income went toward the mortgage, the car loan, and modest pleasures. That duck from the farmer's market cost as much as 5 of her working hours. This wasn't dinner. It was an investment in peace. The phone on the kitchen table buzzed. A message from Russell. "We're on our way. Mom's in a fighting mood, but I'm keeping her under control. Love you. You're the best." The smiley face at the end looked like a nervous attempt to reassure himself. Keeping her under control. Brooke smiled bitterly. Keeping Vivian under control was like trying to conduct an earthquake. She wiped her hands on a towel and looked around the table set in the living room. A snow-white tablecloth, ironed until it crackled. New glasses bought just for tonight. Candles in elegant holders. Perfect. Too perfect, like a magazine spread stripped of life. She felt like an actress frozen backstage, waiting for her cue. She didn't want peace anymore. She just wanted it to be over. Half an hour before the guests arrived, she managed to take a shower and change into a simple but elegant dark blue house dress. No apron, no signs of kitchen chaos. She had to greet them like a queen in her castle, not like an exhausted cook. She adjusted her hair and looked at her reflection in the hallway mirror. Pale, with a feverish shine in her eyes. Too tense. She forced a smile. It came out crooked, pitiful. "Calm down, Brooke. It's just an evening. One evening," Russell promised. The mantra didn't work. Her body knew the truth. Her shoulders were tight, her fingers cold. She was ready for a fight, not a celebration. The doorbell rang sharply, deafeningly, like a starter pistol or a gong signaling the beginning of a round. Brooke flinched, took a deep breath, and went to open the door, rehearsing a welcoming smile as she walked. Her heart was pounding somewhere in her throat, making it hard to breathe. She opened the door wide. Filling the entire doorway stood Vivian. She was wrapped in her signature full-length mink coat, even in the relatively warm hallway. In that fur cocoon, she looked like an icebreaker ready to crush anything in its path through the polar seas of city life. She smelled of expensive perfume, leather, and cold, the scent of power and frost. Her carefully made-up face, with perfectly shaped brows and bright lipstick, showed nothing but condescending superiority. Next to her, slightly behind, like an eternal adjutant to a general, hovered her husband, Joseph. A quiet, hunched man with a guilty expression that seemed to have become his second nature. He held a bag with a bottle of wine and a box of chocolates, the standard guest offering, which in his hands looked like tribute paid to a victor. Brooke opened her mouth to say the rehearsed line. "Hello, Vivian. Joseph. Come in. We've been waiting for you." But she didn't get the chance. Vivian stepped over the threshold without even looking at her. She shrugged the heavy mothball and triumph-scented coat off her broad shoulders and without turning around, almost tossed it at Brooke. The fur, cold and heavy, slid over her arms, fell against her dress, nearly knocking her off balance. "Hang it up and don't get in the way," Vivian snapped over her shoulder as she glided deeper into the apartment, her heels clicking against the laminate floor. That was it. The world froze. Brooke stood in the hallway, clutching that enormous alien fur monster, heavy with cold and humiliation. Her mother-in-law's words, spoken casually, as if to a servant, as if to empty space, echoed in the deafening silence of her shattered hopes. Something inside her snapped, loud and dry, like a burned-out light bulb. It was the sound of her patience breaking, the sound of a truce ending before it even began. Russell's promise, his proud, "I talked to her," crumbled into dust, into pathetic ash. She saw Russell step out of the room and freeze halfway. His face twisted. He shot his mother an angry look, but she no longer saw him, scanning the living room with her X-ray vision. Joseph slipped past Brooke, lowered his eyes guiltily, and held out the bag. "This is for you," he muttered, as if apologizing for everything at once, for his wife, for the evening, for his own existence. Russell stepped toward Brooke, opened his mouth to say something, to take the coat from her, but she stopped him with a barely noticeable shake of her head. "No, don't." She no longer felt hurt or humiliation. Those warm human feelings had evaporated, leaving behind only a cold, ringing emptiness. And in that emptiness, something else was forming, an icy, crystal-clear calculation. She was not a victim. She would not be a victim anymore. She accepted the challenge. The game had begun, and she hadn't set the rules, but that didn't mean she couldn't change the ending. Calmly, with deliberate, almost ritual precision, she turned and walked to the built-in closet in the hallway. She opened the mirrored door. Inside hung her and Russell's jackets, his coat, her light trench. The ordinary life of an ordinary family. She took out wide wooden hangers, bought especially for heavy clothing. Carefully, as if it weren't a fur coat but a fragile Ming Dynasty vase, she placed it on the hanger, smoothed the fur, adjusted the collar, and made sure the hem hung evenly without touching the floor. Then she took the special fur brush from the shelf and, with a few light strokes, smoothed the pile, giving it a perfect look. The whole procedure took no more than a minute, but it was the longest minute of her life. Russell and his father watched in silence, not daring to interrupt this strange, tense ritual. When she was done, Brooke hung the coat in the farthest corner of the closet, away from their clothes. Then, just as slowly and quietly, she closed the mirrored door. The soft click of the latch sounded like the final chord of a funeral march for her hopes. She straightened up and turned to the men. Her face wore a polite but completely unreadable mask. The smile frozen on her lips never reached her eyes. Her gaze was cold and clear, like a winter sky. "Please, let's go to the table," she said in an even, calm voice, without a trace of hurt. She was no longer a welcoming hostess waiting for praise. She was an observer, a strategist who had just received undeniable proof of her opponent's intentions. She was back in the game, but in a completely different role. The evening was no longer going to be slow and pleasant. It promised to be very, very interesting. She silently promised herself that Vivian would regret every word and every gesture, starting with that tossed coat. And Brooke would do everything to make this evening unforgettable for her mother-in-law. The living room, bathed in the warm light of a floor lamp and the flicker of candles, greeted them with ceremonial silence. The table set for 4 looked flawless. Plates gleamed, glasses caught the light, and in crystal bowls at the center, appetizers and salads glowed with color. It was a picture of peace and abundance, cruelly clashing with the icy war declared in the hallway. Vivian scanned the table with a look better suited to a health inspector who had found a cockroach in a Michelin-starred restaurant. She slowly walked around it, running a finger adorned with a heavy gold ring along the edge of the tablecloth. Brooke followed the movement, physically feeling how the sharp edge of the ring scratched not the fabric, but her nerves. A white tablecloth. Bold, Brooke, very bold, especially when the menu includes something with a rich sauce, she drawled, sitting down at the head of the table, the seat she had silently claimed as her own. That spot across from the TV was usually Russell's, but now he, like his father, obediently took a seat on the side, yielding the high ground to his mother. "I'll be careful, Vivian," Brooke replied calmly, taking the seat opposite her. Now they sat face to face, like 2 generals studying the map of an upcoming battle. As usual, Joseph tried to ease the tension. He poured himself some mineral water and said with exaggerated enthusiasm, "Everything looks so beautiful. Brooke, you're a magician." Vivian immediately cut him off before he could finish. "Joseph, don't start. Beautiful is in an art museum. This is dinner. You're supposed to eat it, not admire it." She took a napkin, shook it with faint disgust, and placed it on her lap. Then her gaze stopped on the glasses. "What's this? For wine?" She pointed with a perfectly manicured burgundy nail at the elegant white wine glass Brooke had placed next to the red. "Yes, Vivian. 1 for white, 1 for red," Brooke explained patiently. Vivian clicked her tongue, the sound slicing through the room like a whip crack. In our day, everything was simpler. 1 shot glass for whiskey, 1 glass for everything else, and everyone was happy. Now, 10 forks, 10 glasses, all just to show off. No substance. Russell couldn't take it anymore. "Mom, why are you starting? Brooke bought these glasses on purpose. It's called culture." "Culture!" Vivian mocked, twisting her voice into a shrill caricature. "Son, culture is when you can afford not to think about which glass to drink from. But when you buy glasses instead of saving for a down payment on a proper apartment, that's called something else." The blow was precise and painful. Their improper mortgaged apartment had always been a favorite target of her barbs. Vivian and Joseph lived in a spacious pre-war apartment downtown, inherited from their parents, and sincerely believed that any housing outside the center was just a temporary shelter for losers. Brooke felt the blood rush to her cheeks. She looked at Russell, searching for support. He sat there red-faced and furious, fists clenched under the table. He opened his mouth to respond, but Brooke got ahead of him again, this time with action. She picked up the bottle of white wine Joseph had brought and asked with a light smile, "Shall we start? It is our anniversary after all. Let's drink to us." She seized the initiative, shifting the focus away from the humiliating lecture to the formal reason for the gathering. Vivian pressed her lips together, annoyed at being interrupted mid-sermon, but didn't dare object. A celebration was a celebration. Brooke poured wine for everyone, herself just a symbolic few drops. She needed a clear head. "Well, to you," Vivian said reluctantly, barely lifting her glass. "I wish you wisdom, my son. And you, Brooke, patience. You'll need it." They drank, Joseph in one gulp, as if it were medicine, Russell with grim determination. Brooke didn't sip at all. She set her glass down and put some shrimp salad on her plate. Then came the food inspection. Vivian speared one shrimp with her fork, examined it from all sides like an entomologist studying a rare insect, and put it in her mouth. She chewed slowly, deliberately, listening to her own sensations as if she were tasting a 3 Michelin-star dish. Brooke waited. She knew the verdict was coming. "The grapefruit is bitter," Vivian finally declared, pushing the plate slightly away. "It overpowers everything. The shrimp themselves are fine, but this combination is like wearing rubber boots with a tuxedo. Ridiculous." She moved on to the tongue salad. The same ritual, the same pause. "Too much mayonnaise. Brooke, dear, you're a designer. You should have a sense of proportion. This salad has completely drowned in sauce. It's unhealthy and unattractive." Brooke stayed silent. She didn't make excuses or argue. She simply nodded, like a diligent student listening to a strict teacher's remarks. Her calmness seemed to irritate Vivian far more than tears or open rudeness would have. She expected a battle and got polite indifference instead. That only pushed her to raise the stakes. "And what is this supposed to be?" Her finger pointed at the Olivier salad with crayfish tails. "Russell, do you remember how your grandmother used to make Olivier? That was flavor, the taste of childhood. And this," she grimaced, "this is some kind of misunderstanding. Why ruin a good product? Crayfish tails should be eaten separately with white wine, not mixed with potatoes." "Mom, it's really good," Russell burst out, piling his plate high with that very salad. "Brooke spent half the day cooking all this." "Half the day!" Vivian threw up her hands, her bracelets clinking like shackles. "If a woman spent half a day in the kitchen in my time, her husband would go hungry. I cooked a 3-course lunch for the whole family in an hour, and everyone was full and happy. You just need to know how to manage your time, not put on performances." "Efficiency, son. That's what matters, not effects." She said it while looking straight at Brooke. In her eyes gleamed pure, unclouded triumph. She was winning. Step by step, she was tearing down the world Brooke had built so carefully, proving to both her son and this upstart daughter-in-law who the main woman was, whose authority was untouchable. But Brooke looked at her and saw not a fearsome goddess, but a deeply unhappy, aging woman whose only joy in life was humiliating others. A woman whose own life was apparently so empty that she had to fill it by invading someone else's. And in that moment, Brooke felt not anger, but a cold, almost scientific curiosity. How far would she go? Where was her limit? "Joseph, why are you silent? Swallow your tongue?" Vivian suddenly turned on her husband. "Do you like everything?" Joseph flinched. He was in the middle of enthusiastically eating the very tongue salad his wife had just torn apart. He choked and started coughing. Russell patted him on the back. "It's good," Joseph rasped, wiping his lips with a napkin. "Really good, Brooke." Vivian's eyes flashed. Betrayal. Even this man, the most obedient of her subjects, dared to voice an opinion different from hers. "Good for him," she hissed. "Joseph, your taste has been ruined by decades of college cafeteria lunches. You can't be objective." She turned away from him with such contempt as if he had just confessed to treason. Joseph shrank, pulled his head into his shoulders, and stared at his plate. He wouldn't say another word for the rest of the evening. Brooke knew that. The atmosphere at the table grew so dense, it felt like it could be cut with a knife. The silence was broken only by the nervous tapping of Russell's fork against his plate and Vivian's deliberately heavy sighs. She wasn't eating. She sat, leaned back in her chair like a Roman emperor at gladiator games, savoring the effect she had created. Brooke realized it was time to move to the next act. She stood up. "The main course is coming," she announced with the same unruffled smile. She walked into the kitchen, feeling 3 pairs of eyes on her back. Russell's were full of desperation and pleading, Joseph's of guilty sympathy, and Vivian's of predatory anticipation. The main dish, the main target. In the kitchen, she leaned her forehead against the cold tile for a few seconds. Inhale, exhale, calm. Everything was going according to plan. Only now, it was her plan. She wasn't defending herself anymore. She was preparing to attack. She took the duck out of the oven. It was magnificent, golden, with a crisp skin, giving off a divine aroma. The smell hit her face almost physically, thick, complex, woven from dozens of notes. The sweet tang of baked apples, the resinous scent of thyme, the spicy warmth of cinnamon and nutmeg, all set against the deep, solid base of perfectly roasted duck meat. For a moment, Brooke froze in the kitchen doorway, holding the heavy oval platter. This was her masterpiece, her answer to everything. She carried it like a banner, like a final argument in a losing debate. For just one tiny second, the naive girl who had believed in a truce that morning stirred inside her again. She thought, surely no one could see something this beautiful and stay cruel. The thought was so pathetic and helpless that Brooke crushed it instantly. Of course they could. That was exactly what Vivian was about to do. She entered the living room. When Russell saw her, he jumped up, pushed back his chair, and rushed to help. In his eyes flickered a mix of pride in his wife and almost childlike hope that now, everything would be okay. This magnificent, festive-smelling bird was supposed to be the white flag that would reconcile the warring sides. "Brooke, let me," he said, overly cheerful. "Careful." He took the heavy platter from her hands and set it in the center of the table like a man placing a crown on a monarch's head. "Mom, Dad, look at this." "Isn't it a work of art?" Joseph gasped sincerely. He leaned over the dish, inhaling the aroma, and an expression of pure, unclouded pleasure appeared on his worn face. "Brooke, this is incredible. The smell alone is amazing. Vivian, look." But Vivian didn't look. She leaned back even farther in her chair, crossing her arms over her chest. Her posture radiated extreme skepticism, as if she had been offered not the centerpiece of a holiday dinner, but a ticket for a tour of a sewage plant. She waited until Russell sat down, and only then, slowly, like a queen granting an audience, shifted her gaze to the duck. Her look was cold and analytical. It slid over the golden skin, lingered on the apples caramelized in duck fat, and stopped at the sprig of rosemary Brooke had used as garnish. "Rosemary," she drawled, and the first notes of the coming storm crept into her voice. "With duck? A bold choice. It's usually used for lamb or beef. It's too aggressive for such a delicate bird, but perhaps there's some avant-garde idea here." The word avant-garde on her lips sounded like a synonym for tasteless. Brooke remained silent as she sat down. Her heart was no longer racing. It beat evenly, coldly, counting down the seconds to the inevitable. She took the large carving knife and fork. "Let me," Russell offered again, trying to salvage the situation. "No." Brooke stopped him gently but firmly. "I'll do it. I know how." It was her first open act of defiance that evening. A small thing, but meaningful. She didn't let him take this last ritual from her. She was the hostess of this table. She was the author of this dish, and she would carry out the execution herself. Under her mother-in-law's attentive, predatory gaze, she began to carve the duck. The knife slid easily into the meat with a soft whisper, revealing juicy pink flesh. Juice splashed onto the platter. The duck was perfect, not dry at all. Brooke felt a stab of malicious triumph. She knew her mother-in-law had already prepared the verdict, dry, and now would have to look for a new one. She arranged the best pieces on the plates, breast for Joseph, who looked at her with puppy-like adoration, a leg for Russell, a wing for herself, and the neatest, juiciest piece of breast she placed on Vivian's plate and handed it to her. Their eyes met over the table. In Brooke's eyes was a cold challenge. In her mother-in-law's, a promise of retaliation. Vivian took the plate as if it were contaminated. She cut off a microscopic piece of meat, smaller than her pinky nail, and put it in her mouth. And the performance began. She froze again, closed her eyes, her jaws moving almost imperceptibly. She wasn't eating. She was conducting a chemical analysis. Russell and Joseph went still, afraid to breathe. They waited for the verdict. "Well then," she finally said, opening her eyes. Her gaze wasn't directed at Brooke, but somewhere into the distance, as if she were addressing a higher court of culinary critics. "The meat really isn't dry, I'll admit that. Even too juicy, almost raw in places." She poked her fork into the very center of the piece, where the meat had a delicate pink shade, exactly as properly cooked duck should. "That's dangerous, Brooke. Poultry has to be cooked all the way through. Salmonella doesn't sleep." Russell slammed his palm on the table, making the glasses clink. "Mom, it's duck breast. It's cooked medium. It's supposed to be pink. Have you ever been to a decent restaurant? This is perfect doneness." "Restaurants," Vivian snorted, her upper lip curling with disdain. "Don't teach me how to cook, son. I raised you on my food, and you were never poisoned. Restaurants are for show-offs, for people with extra money and no brains. They'll serve you any garbage under a French name, and you'll be happy to pay. Because for your generation, it's not the substance that matters, but the form, the packaging, a pretty picture on Instagram. And what's behind it? Emptiness." Her monologue, which had started with the duck, smoothly turned into a global accusation against an entire generation, the generation Brooke, in her opinion, represented here. Joseph, hearing the word restaurants, shrank and began quickly cutting his piece into tiny bits, trying to eat it before his wife forbade him to. Brooke picked up her water glass and took a small sip. She looked at her mother-in-law, trying to understand the source of this insatiable, all-consuming malice. What drove this woman? Was it just the need to dominate? Or was it envy? Envy of youth, of love, even love locked into a 2-bedroom apartment with a mortgage, envy that her own son had built a family separate from her. "We live in a different time now, Vivian," Brooke said calmly, deciding to add fuel to the fire. "Values are different. People don't just want to eat to survive. They want to enjoy food, enjoy life." "Enjoyment?" Vivian pounced on the word like a hawk on its prey. "What kind of enjoyment can there be when you've got a 25-year mortgage around your neck? Do you even understand what that means? A quarter-century of slavery. You'll be paying off that kennel until retirement. What enjoyment are you talking about, girl? Your enjoyment is self-deception. You pretend to live a full life. You buy trendy glasses, cook duck with rosemary, but in reality you're poor, just poverty with a nice wrapper." She spoke loudly, clearly, hammering every word. She had completely dropped the mask of decency. Russell went pale. The mention of the mortgage was a low blow. They were proud of their apartment, their first real home. And now his mother was methodically grinding that pride into the dirt. "Mom, stop it," his voice cracked. "We'll handle our finances ourselves. It's none of your business." "None of my business?" Her eyebrows shot up in mock surprise. "My son is living in bondage. My future grandchildren will grow up in 2 rooms overlooking a parking lot. Of course it's my business. I worked my whole life. Your father and I never asked anyone for a cent so you could get an education and stand on your own feet. And for what? So you could tie your life to a woman with her head in the clouds and not the slightest understanding of financial literacy." She turned her scorching gaze on Brooke. "Do you even understand what money is? You're a freelancer. Today you have work, tomorrow you don't. That's not a job, it's a hobby. How can you build a family on such a shaky foundation?" The husband grinds away in an office from morning till night, while the wife draws her little pictures and thinks that's a contribution to the family budget. A real contribution is a stable salary, a pension, benefits, not these so-called projects of yours. Brooke felt a cold rage boiling inside her. Her work, the thing she loved, which sometimes brought in more than Russell's salary, which gave her freedom and independence, had just been dismissed as a hobby and little pictures. She clenched her fists under the table until her nails dug into her palms. But her face still held a mask of polite attention. She even allowed herself a light, sympathetic smile. "You're right, Vivian. Stability is very important," she said, in an even, almost hypnotic voice. "That's exactly why we took out a mortgage. It's an investment in the future, our own apartment, which in 25 years will be worth several times more. That's much smarter than paying rent to some stranger." "An investment," Vivian laughed loudly, unpleasantly. "Girl, don't make me laugh. Real investments are what smart people do. Stocks, bonds, rental properties, not buying a concrete box on the edge of the world just to live in. That's a liability, not an asset. Learn the basics, as they say." She was in her element. Financial terms, thrown around with the air of an expert, were meant to crush the ignorant daughter-in-law once and for all. She leaned back in her chair with satisfaction, feeling like an economics professor lecturing failing freshmen. "Your father and I," she nodded toward her husband, who seemed frozen to his chair in fear, "always thought ahead. We never lived just for today. There was always a reserve, always a safety cushion. That's why we can afford to live, not just survive. Travel twice a year, not to Mexico on a last-minute deal, but to decent places. Change cars not when they fall apart, but when a new model comes out. That's what knowing how to live means, Russell. Not rotting inside four walls, getting excited over duck with apples." As she spoke, she casually adjusted the heavy gold bracelet on her wrist, then touched her earrings with large stones that Brooke had always found tasteless. It was a display, a parade of vanity. "Look at me, successful, wealthy, wise, and look at you, losers." At that exact moment, a phone inside her handbag, resting on the chair beside her, began to vibrate insistently. The sound was loud and irritating. Vivian frowned but reached into her bag. "Excuse me," she tossed out carelessly. "Important call." She glanced at the screen, and for a split second something like anxiety flickered across her face, but she immediately hid it behind a mask of business-like concern. She didn't reject the call or step away. On the contrary, she accepted it and put it on speaker, as if she wanted everyone to witness just how busy and important she was. "Yes, I'm listening," she said in an authoritative voice. A polite female voice came through the phone. "Vivian, good evening. This is Sandra, your personal bank manager. Is this a good time to talk?" The bank. Brooke tensed. Russell looked at his mother in surprise. "Sandra, I asked not to be disturbed in the evening," Vivian said coldly, throwing a triumphant glance at the others. "I'm at a family dinner. What is it?" "I'm sorry, Vivian, but the information is urgent. Regarding your application..." "Sandra..." Vivian cut her off sharply. Her voice turned to steel. "We'll discuss all the details in the office on Monday. The terms must be perfect, you understand? Goodbye." She ended the call without waiting for a response. Then she placed the phone face down on the table and swept the room with a triumphant look. "Business," she sighed with exaggerated weariness. "Not a moment of peace, even on the weekend. When you move in certain circles, there's no escape from it. Constant offers, projects, deals." She fell silent, waiting for questions. But none came. Russell looked at his mother with a new, unfamiliar expression. Joseph seemed not to understand what had just happened at all. And Brooke? Brooke was silent because, in her mind, the pieces of a giant puzzle were crashing together with a deafening grind. A few days earlier, on Thursday, Vivian had stopped by for a minute to drop off some of Russell's old childhood things. She asked Brooke for a tablet to check her email. Without a second thought, Brooke handed her the iPad Vivian sometimes used when she visited. Vivian glanced at something quickly, closed the cover, and left. That evening, Brooke picked up the tablet to finish some work and saw that her mother-in-law had forgotten to log out of her email. Brooke wasn't going to read anything. She was about to tap log out. But her eyes caught the subject line of the latest message. It was from a large commercial bank, and the subject read, "Your application for a personal loan has been preliminarily approved." At the time, she hadn't thought much of it. An application is an application. Maybe she was just checking the terms. Brooke logged out and forgot about it. But now, this call. Your personal manager. Regarding your application, the information is urgent. And Vivian's panicked reaction, her sharp, "We'll discuss it on Monday." Everything clicked into place. The bragging about a luxurious life, the lectures about real investments, the contempt for their mortgage, all of it was a bluff, a facade, a Potemkin village built to maintain the image of a successful, all-powerful matriarch. And behind that facade, a desperate attempt to get a loan. A large one, judging by the personal manager and the urgency. A personal loan, meaning not for business, not for investments. So what for? A new car she had mentioned so casually? That very proper foreign vacation? To keep up the illusion of wealth she valued so much? And most importantly, she was doing it in secret, from her husband, who, judging by his blank expression, had no idea. From her son, whom she had just lectured on financial literacy. A chill ran down Brooke's spine. This wasn't just a small lie. It was a bomb. A delayed action bomb ticking right here at this table. And the detonator had just landed in her hands. She looked at Vivian differently now, not as a tyrant, but as a con artist. A small, pathetic con artist who had built her power in the family on lies. All that arrogance, all that superiority, it was just armor, a way to hide her own failure. Brooke took another sip of water. Her hands no longer trembled. Her mind was crystal clear. She knew what to do. All that remained was to wait for the right moment, and she would create that moment herself. "You seem tired, Vivian," Brooke said in a soft, sympathetic voice. "Are work matters wearing you out that much? Let me make you some tea, and dessert will be ready in a moment. My signature lemon tart. I'm sure it will lift your spirits." She stood up to clear the plates from the main course. Russell tried to help again, but she stopped him with a look. She moved through the room smoothly, silently, like a predator that had already chosen its prey and was now simply enjoying the hunt. She took Joseph's plate, he had picked the bone clean, then Russell's, which was empty as well, and walked over to her mother-in-law. Vivian's plate was almost untouched. A piece of duck lay there, cut but uneaten. "You didn't like it, Vivian?" Brooke asked with the same deadly politeness. Vivian snapped out of her thoughts. She looked at the plate, then at Brooke. "I told you, it's undercooked," she said curtly, slipping back into her usual role. "I care about my health, unlike some people." Of course. Your health is the most important thing," Brooke agreed, taking the plate. She went into the kitchen, put the dishes in the sink, and froze for a few seconds, leaning against the counter. The plan formed instantly. Bold, ruthless, and brilliant in its simplicity. She needed proof. Solid, undeniable proof. Not just a memory of a subject line in an email. The tablet. It was lying on the coffee table in the living room. Vivian was sure she had logged out. But modern systems often remember passwords and offer quick access, especially if the user isn't very tech-savvy. And Vivian, for all her bravado, was exactly that kind of user. But how to get to the tablet unnoticed? She had to distract everyone, create some commotion. She returned to the living room empty-handed. "Oh!" She slapped her forehead with an expression of great distress. "I completely forgot. Lemon. I wanted to serve fresh lemon with the tea. I had such a big, beautiful one. I think I left it in my bag, in the car, when I came back from the store. Russell reacted immediately. Brooke, no need for lemon. Why bother? Everything's already great. No, a tart without fresh lemon isn't the same. She dramatized it like a global disaster. I'll be right back, just a minute. Russell, sweetheart, could you help me? The bags are heavy. I'll take the trash too. Walk me out? It was a risky move. She needed to lure Russell out of the apartment so he wouldn't see her handling the tablet. And Vivian, she was so confident in her superiority that she was unlikely to suspect anything. To her, Brooke was just a fussy, simple-minded girl obsessed with kitchen details. Sure, let me get dressed, Russell said, clearly relieved at the chance to help with something and escape the suffocating atmosphere. He headed to the hallway. Joseph, you can watch TV for now. The news should be starting, Brooke chirped as she passed her father-in-law. Vivian, I'll be 5 minutes. Don't get bored. She slipped past her mother-in-law, who was sitting in an armchair, and as she walked by the coffee table, casually brushed her hand over it as if wiping off imaginary dust. At that moment, her fingers touched the tablet. She picked it up, pressed it to herself, and, shielding it with her body, quickly stepped into the hallway, where Russell was already putting on his shoes. Why do you have the tablet? He asked, surprised. Oh, right. The battery's low. I'll plug it in by the outlet in the hallway, she improvised instantly. Come on. They went out to the stairwell. Brooke shoved the trash bag into Russell's hands. You take this out for now, and I'll run for the lemon. I'll be quick. Without waiting for an answer, she dashed down the stairs, skipping steps. She didn't need any lemon. She needed 30 seconds. One flight down, she crouched on the steps and opened the tablet. Her heart was pounding wildly, her fingers shaking. She tapped the email icon. A moment of waiting that felt like an eternity, and yes. The system logged into Vivian's account automatically. The password was saved. She scanned the list of messages quickly. There it was, an email from the same bank, but newer, today's. Subject: Congratulations, your loan in the amount of $85,000 has been approved. 85,000. The number burned into her mind. This wasn't just money for a car. It was a huge, catastrophic sum for their family. A consumer loan with a predatory interest rate, taken in secret from her husband, a retired man who would automatically become a co-borrower if anything went wrong. Brooke stopped thinking. She moved on autopilot. Screenshot. She captured the screen with the sender, the subject line, and the amount clearly visible. Then she quickly opened a messenger app and sent the screenshot to herself. Deleted the sent message from the tablet's memory, logged out of the email, closed all apps, shut the cover. Done. The evidence was hers. Digital, undeniable. She tucked the tablet under her arm and ran upstairs. Russell was just coming back from the trash chute. So, did you find it? He asked. No, can you believe it? It's not in the car either, she said, skillfully acting annoyed. I must have left it at the store. Oh well, we'll manage. They went back into the apartment. The first thing Brooke did was walk into the living room and put the tablet back in the exact same place where it had been lying. Vivian and Joseph were watching the news. Joseph with interest, Vivian with a vacant look. She was still digesting her triumph and the unpleasant phone call. She noticed nothing. Well, no lemon then. Guess we'll drink tea as it is, Brooke announced cheerfully as she headed to the kitchen. She put the kettle on. Her hands were still trembling slightly, but it was no longer fear. It was the thrill of the hunt. As it heated up, the kettle began to sing, thin and piercing, like a nerve stretched to its limit and finally snapping. Brooke took it off the heat before it could choke on its own whistle. For a few seconds, she just stood there, watching the bubbles dance inside the glass body. Just like inside her, boiling, churning, ready to burst, but held back by the thin walls of self-control. She felt like a sapper who hadn't just found a bomb, but now had to sit smiling at the same table with the terrorist, until the very end of the show. The screenshot on her phone, saved in an archived chat with herself, wasn't just leverage. It was a button. A red button that could, in an instant, bring down this entire false, pompous structure called Vivian. And the sweet, intoxicating sense of power she felt holding that button was far stronger than any hurt. She took the teapot from the shelf, a round white porcelain one with a snowy cornflower pattern, a housewarming gift from her mother. Vivian had once called it petty bourgeois pastoral. Today, that pastoral would become part of the set for a tragedy. Brooke added loose-leaf bergamot tea and a couple of sprigs of mint. Then she took the tart out of the fridge. It was perfect. A golden almond crust, a snow-white layer of meringue like alpine snow, lightly torched to coffee-colored peaks, with fine lime zest on top. It looked like a work of art, a small, edible masterpiece. And she knew that this masterpiece was about to be ritually destroyed. When she entered the living room with the tray, steam rising from the teapot and the tart displayed proudly, Vivian was just finishing a lecture to her husband. "And I don't understand, Joseph, how you can watch this nonsense. Pure propaganda and lies. An intelligent person filters information instead of swallowing everything the screen feeds them," she proclaimed, even though 5 minutes earlier she herself had been staring blankly at the same TV. Joseph, realizing his modest attempt to enjoy the news had failed, lowered his eyes guiltily. Russell sat staring at one point, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles in his cheeks twitched. He looked like a spring compressed to its limit. "Tea is ready," Brooke announced brightly, placing the tray on the table. "And dessert. Lemon tart on almond flour with Italian meringue." She deliberately used those trendy, restaurant-style words. It was a challenge. She was throwing out bait, knowing the predator wouldn't resist. Joseph perked up. His eyes lit up with almost childlike delight. "My God, Brooke, it's beautiful. It's like a pastry shop on Madison Avenue. Vivian, just look." Russell looked at the tart too, with gratitude, as if this dessert were a small island of normalcy in an ocean of madness. Vivian slowly turned her head. She examined the tart the way one looks at a fake Fabergé, long, closely, with faint disgust. "Almond flour, meringue," she drawled, tasting the words like something unpleasant. "How much time did you waste on this, Brooke?" "Oh, not that long when you know the technique," Brooke replied lightly, picking up the cake knife. 4 hours, no more." 4 hours, Vivian repeated, steel ringing in her voice. 4 hours of life spent on a pie that will be eaten in 5 minutes. What astonishing inefficiency. She didn't wait for Brooke to plate the dessert. She took a teaspoon, scooped a tiny bit of meringue from the edge, and brought it to her mouth. Her face showed nothing. Then she did the same with the lemon curd and a bit of the crust. "Too sweet," she delivered the first verdict. "Cloyingly sweet. Makes your teeth ache. Bad for the pancreas. At your age, Brooke, you should be thinking about your health, not just about how pretty it looks. And the crust," she poked at the shortbread with her spoon. "It crumbles. Proper sablé should be dense and crisp, not turned to dust. You lack good butter, girl. Real butter, not the margarine you buy on sale." Brooke stayed silent, continuing to cut the tart. She served a large, generous piece to Joseph. He accepted the plate like a co-conspirator and immediately dug in with his fork, trying to eat as much as possible before his wife stopped him. The second piece went to Russell. He looked at Brooke with such pain in his eyes that for a second she felt sorry for him. He had failed his mission. He had promised her peace and brought war straight into their home. Now he was nothing more than a helpless witness to the execution of her efforts. She didn't cut a piece for herself. Finally, she placed an empty dessert plate in front of her mother-in-law. "I see you didn't like it, Vivian," she said with the same gentle smile. "I won't force you." It was a subtle move. She deprived Vivian of the chance to continue the execution on a full slice. Vivian frowned, clearly annoyed. She wanted not just to pass judgment, She wanted to savor the process, slowly, with commentary, destroying Brooke's creation. And that pleasure had been taken from her. "I care about my figure and my health," she shot back coldly. "Unlike those who are ready to consume sugar by the ton." That, by the way, is another sign of financial illiteracy. People with low incomes often compensate for the lack of joy in life with cheap carbohydrates. Sugar is a drug for the poor. She took the cup of tea Brooke had poured, sipped it, and set it down. "And bergamot tea, a typical office option. Russell, I'm sure you have the same at work, in tea bags." Russell snapped. He didn't shout. His voice was quiet, which made it even more frightening. "Enough. Mom, I'm asking you, just enough. Stop. You came to our celebration, to our home. If you don't like anything here, the tablecloth, the glasses, the food, the tea, us, then the door is where the entrance is. No one is keeping you." A deafening silence fell. Joseph froze with his fork halfway to his mouth. Vivian slowly turned to her son. Her face, which until then had shown nothing but arrogant boredom, hardened into something like a stone mask. "Are you throwing me out?" she asked in an icy tone. "I'm asking you to respect my wife and my home," Russell said firmly, looking her straight in the eyes. It was a mutiny, a real, open mutiny on her ship. Brooke saw fury flash in her mother-in-law's eyes, but Vivian was too smart to cause a scene. She chose a different tactic. She smiled with a pitiful, condescending smirk. "My dear boy." She shook her head as if speaking to an unreasonable child. "You didn't understand anything. I'm not criticizing. I'm teaching. I'm opening your eyes to how the world really works. I'm trying to explain that this cozy little burrow you think is an achievement is a trap, an illusion of stability. You think you're living, but you're just playing at life, like children building sandcastles in a sandbox." She took a breath and launched into her main monologue. This wasn't for them. It was for herself. She reveled in the sound of her own voice, in her imagined wisdom and success. "Real life," she proclaimed, leaning back in her chair and folding her hands on the table to show off her expensive watch, "is freedom. Freedom from circumstances. Freedom from having to look at price tags. When you don't think about how much a duck or a bottle of wine costs. You just take what you want. Your father and I are looking at a country house now. Not those little plots with plywood shacks you people like, but a proper property in the Hamptons. Do you know what it's like there, Russell? The ocean, pine trees, decent neighbors. You could even build your own dock." Brooke smiled inwardly. The Hamptons. A plot there cost as much as 3 of their apartments. $85,000 wasn't even a down payment. It might cover a realtor's fees and paperwork. "Of course, it's a serious investment," Vivian continued, as if reading her thoughts. "But money has to work. Property in a place like that is eternal value. It's status. It's something you leave to your grandchildren. Not like your mortgage, which will end up eating half the apartment's value in interest paid to the bank. And the car." She switched topics without letting anyone get a word in. "Joseph, ours is getting old, don't you think? 5 years. That's already an age. Time to replace it. I've picked out a new crossover, the latest model. The interior, the electronics. It's pure pleasure. Driving a beautiful, new, reliable car, feeling like a proper human being." She cast a fleeting glance at their modest Hyundai Elantra, the key to which lay on the hallway shelf. They had paid off that loan only 6 months ago. "For that, you need courage." She raised a finger, getting carried away. "Financial courage. You need to know how to take risks. Sometimes you have to make a sharp move, rebalance assets, carry out 1 or 2 operations that don't necessarily need to be known by certain regulators." As she said this, she threw a quick, almost imperceptible glance at her husband, at Joseph, and that was her fatal mistake. The look was full of condescension and faint contempt. It said clearly, "With your engineer's salary and your retirement mindset, you'll never understand this." Joseph, who until that moment had been more like a piece of furniture, suddenly stirred. Barely noticeable, but real. He stopped chewing his tart. He looked up at his wife, and in his usually dull gaze, something new flickered. Confusion, hurt, and something like suspicion. He didn't understand the details of her financial maneuvers, but he understood the tone perfectly. The tone used to talk about an incompetent relative. Brooke saw it. She saw something begin to wake up in the quiet swamp called Joseph. Her button could cause an explosion, but for maximum effect, she needed shrapnel that would hit every target. And her silent father-in-law was one of those fragments. A house in the Hamptons, a new crossover, Brooke drawled with feigned admiration. That's an enormous amount of money, Vivian. How do you manage it? You must be a brilliant investor. The flattery worked instantly. Vivian straightened her shoulders. It's not brilliance, Brooke. It's experience and knowing life. I don't waste money on nonsense. Every dollar I have is invested wisely. I can afford big purchases because I have what people like to call now a diversified portfolio. She clearly enjoyed the phrase. Diversified portfolio. It sounded solid, much more solid than an $85,000 consumer loan at 28% interest. I just want my son to learn this too. She turned back to Russell. Her voice softened, became maternal and instructive. So he doesn't repeat the mistakes of, let's say, not very far-sighted people. So he strives for more. So his wife inspires him, instead of dragging him down into the swamp of everyday life. Salads and 4-hour pies. The last blow landed on Brooke again, direct, without disguise. She was the anchor pulling her brilliant son to the bottom. Russell didn't respond anymore. He looked drained. All his energy, all his anger was gone, leaving only helplessness. He had lost. He knew it. And he looked at Brooke with a silent plea for forgiveness. And then Vivian, having reached the peak of her self-satisfaction, decided to perform an act of supreme mercy, humiliating, like alms. She opened her handbag, took out a crocodile skin wallet, opened it, pulled out a stack of $100 bills, counted a few, and placed them on the table, right on the white tablecloth, next to the half-eaten tart. Here, she said quietly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. Take this, $3,000, just like that, a gift for your anniversary. Pay off one of your credit cards, or buy yourselves something decent. I don't want my son living in need. It hurts me to watch. It was a public execution, a slap delivered with a wad of cash. The money lay on the tablecloth like evidence, like a symbol of their humiliation. It screamed louder than words. You're poor, your failures, and I, your benefactor, lower myself to you. Russell turned crimson. He stared at the money, his lips trembling. Mom, take that away. Now. Don't be stupid, she said gently. Don't be proud where it's inappropriate. It's just money. It's meant to help, especially family. Take it away, I said, Russell shouted, his voice breaking. He jumped up, knocking over his chair. It crashed to the floor. And in that moment, Brooke knew it was time. The stage was set, the actors at peak emotion. The audience in the form of Joseph was perfectly primed. The curtain could rise. She lifted her hand, gently stopping Russell. Wait, sweetheart. Her voice was calm, almost serene. She looked at her mother-in-law with a tender, understanding smile. Vivian just wants to help us, from the bottom of her heart. Isn't that right? Vivian, pleased with the effect she had made, nodded condescendingly. Of course, from the heart. That's very generous of you, especially now, Brooke continued, her voice growing softer and more insinuating. When you yourself probably have every penny counted. After all, pulling off such a big deal with a house takes enormous resources. She paused, letting the words sink into the silence. Vivian tensed. Something in her daughter-in-law's tone didn't sit right. The fawning note was gone, replaced by a strange steel edge. But you've surely calculated everything, Brooke added casually. With your experience, Your diversified portfolio. You wouldn't take a risky loan for this, would you? Behind your husband's back. She said the last words almost in a whisper, but in the hanging silence they struck like thunder. Vivian's face changed very slowly. First, the mask of self-satisfaction slipped away, then the condescension, leaving only raw animal panic. She stared at Brooke, fear appearing in her eyes. "What? What are you talking about?" she rasped. When Joseph heard the words, "behind her husband's back," he lifted his head. His confused gaze shifted from his wife to his daughter-in-law. The puzzle in his mind began to come together. That call from the bank, the talk about operations without oversight, and now this. Russell froze as well, not understanding what was happening, but Brooke knew the final blow shouldn't come from her. She had only prepared the ground. The last note had to come from Vivian herself. Brooke just needed to push her there. Vivian had to carry out her own sentence with her own hands. "Oh, I'm so tired of all this money talk." Brooke suddenly laughed lightly, changing the subject. "It is our anniversary after all. Let's get back to dinner. We still haven't given the final verdict on the main dish." She looked around at everyone with a cheerful expression, as if nothing had happened, as if she wasn't holding a lit fuse to a stick of dynamite. "Vivian, you never really gave your final word on the duck. You criticized it for being undercooked, the salads for being overdone. But overall, how did you like our modest holiday table? Your opinion is very important to us. You are our main critic and expert after all." She said it with such disarming sincerity, with such a naive smile, that Vivian hesitated for a moment. She didn't know how to react. Just seconds ago, a terrifying accusation had been thrown in her face, and now she was being asked to evaluate dinner. The dissonance knocked her off balance. She was used to linear conflicts, attack and defense, strike and retreat. This was something else entirely, a chess game with rules she didn't understand. She tried to regain control, to slip back into her familiar role of the all-knowing inspector. It was the only role she truly knew how to play, and in her panic, she did exactly what Brooke was counting on. She decided to end the evening the way she had planned from the start, with her triumph. That comment about a loan was nonsense, a lie, the delirium of a jealous daughter-in-law. She would put her in her place once and for all, with her signature, crushing verdict. She leaned back in her chair again. Her posture was no longer as confident. There was a hint of nervousness now, though she tried hard to hide it. She swept a heavy gaze over the table, lingering on the leftovers, the plates, the glasses. She drew in a deep breath, preparing to deliver her crown jewel of a phrase, the one she had prepared in advance. The phrase meant to be the final nail in the coffin of her daughter-in-law's self-worth. Brooke saw it. She saw the muscle twitch in her mother-in-law's throat, the way her brightly painted lips tightened, the cold, vicious fire of the triumphant judge flaring up in her eyes again. She glanced at Russell. He stood beside his overturned chair, lost and broken. Their eyes met, and Brooke, with the slightest movement of her lashes, gave him a signal. "Stay silent, do nothing, just watch." The atmosphere in the room was charged to the limit. It felt as if the air itself had frozen in anticipation. Joseph, having forgotten about the tart, stared at his wife with dread and expectation. Russell stood still, obeying Brooke's silent command. Vivian held a theatrical pause. She looked past Brooke, straight at the wall, and slowly, carefully enunciating every syllable, prepared to deliver her polished cruelty, her verdict on this evening, this family, this daughter-in-law. She was about to take the highest, final note in her aria of hatred, unaware that it would be her swan song. The daughter-in-law's words, tossed out with such deceptive casualness. A risky loan behind your husband's back, hung in the air like gun smoke. It wasn't just a phrase. It was a password, a secret code that only she knew. And how the hell could that girl know it? That kitchen woman whose life revolved around recipes and discounts on household cleaners. Inside Vivian's head, the gears began to spin wildly. The tablet, She had used Brooke's tablet, but she had logged out of her email. She clearly remembered pressing log out. Or had she? Had that mouse, that gray moth, really been bold enough to dig into her personal correspondence? Impossible. Nonsense. It couldn't be. Most likely it was a coincidence, a lucky guess. She must have overheard something somewhere, some fragment of a phrase, and now, in her stupid attempt to jab back, was building a whole conspiracy theory on it. Yes, that was it. Just a coincidence. A desperate, foolish guess. The icy, sticky fear that had seized her for a second began to retreat, replaced by the familiar, saving rage. How dare she, even if it was just a guess, how dare she say that out loud here in front of her husband and son? She had crossed a line. She had broken all the rules of family warfare by using forbidden weapons, a hint at financial failure. Fine. Then she would get an answer, one she would never recover from. And then Brooke, with her devilish sense of timing, made a move that completely disoriented Vivian. She laughed, lightly, carefree, as if that terrifying accusation hadn't been spoken just 5 seconds earlier. "Oh, I'm so tired of all this money talk," her voice chimed like a bell. "It's our anniversary after all. Let's get back to dinner. We still haven't given the final verdict on the main dish." The abrupt shift from drama to farce was like a feint by an experienced boxer, making the opponent swing at empty air. Vivian had been ready for a counterattack, for a scandal, for tears, anything. But not this. Not a request to judge the duck. Her mind glitched. First came confusion, then suspicion. This was a trap. Brooke was trying to throw her off, steer the conversation away. But why? If she had real proof, she would have struck hard, not gone back to some stupid culinary reviews. Which meant there was no proof. Which meant it had all been a bluff. A pure bluff. The realization flooded Vivian with a hot, intoxicating wave of relief that instantly turned into a sense of superiority. You little snake. You little schemer. You thought you could play psychological games with me? You thought you could scare me? You, who still can't tell sable from shortbread. Fine. You started the game, but I'll be the one to finish it. She returned to her original plan. She would deliver her signature blow, the one prepared at home, rehearsed in front of the mirror. A devastating, perfectly worded phrase meant to be the cherry on top of this evening of humiliation. She would say it, and after that, any pathetic attempts by her daughter-in-law to snap back would sound like the squeak of a crushed mouse. It would be her victory, final and unquestionable. Brooke read this internal struggle and transformation clearly on her mother-in-law's face. She saw fear give way to relief, relief to malice, malice to resolve. She saw Vivian straighten her shoulders, saw that familiar mask of the arrogant inspector settle back into place. She had given her this chance, thrown her a lifeline, knowing Vivian wouldn't grab it to escape, but would use it as a podium for her final speech. "Vivian, you still haven't given your final word on the duck," Brooke chirped, pouring more hot water into her cup. "Your opinion is very important to us. You are our main critic and expert." Those last words, critic and expert, pulled the trigger. Vivian's ego, bruised a moment earlier, demanded satisfaction. She had to reaffirm her status. She leaned back in her chair once more. Her whole posture radiated restored grandeur. Slowly, she surveyed the table, the remains of salads in crystal bowls, crumbs from the tart on Joseph's plate, unfinished wine in the glasses, Russell's overturned chair lying on the floor like a fallen soldier. It was the battlefield after her victorious advance. She took a deep breath. She didn't look at Brooke. She never did when she wanted to humiliate her most deeply. She looked straight through her, at the wall, as if her daughter-in-law were empty space, unworthy of a direct glance. Russell, following Brooke's barely perceptible gesture, stayed still. He didn't pick up the chair. He stood with one hand on the table, his face unreadable, like a poker player's. Joseph, sensing that something final and terrible was about to happen, instinctively hunched his shoulders. In the silence that followed, thick and heavy like a velvet curtain in an old theater, Vivian's voice rang out loud, clear, and venomous. She spoke slowly, savoring every syllable, every sound. Too many salads. The duck is dry. The daughter-in-law is bad. After saying this, she leaned all the way back in her chair, almost reclining, and a triumphant, contemptuous smile bloomed on her lips. That was it. The final chord. Curtain down. She had won. She had said what she wanted. Now she waited for applause, or even better, for tears and hysteria from this upstart. She expected Russell to rush to comfort her, then apologize to his mother. She waited for complete and unconditional surrender, but the silence that followed her words was different. It wasn't heavy. It rang. It was thin and sharp, like a steel string stretched to its limit. You could hear Russell grind his teeth. He stepped forward, his face dark with rage. He opened his mouth to unleash everything that had been boiling inside him all evening, all year of their marriage, his entire life next to this woman. But Brooke was faster. She gently, almost weightlessly, touched his hand. "Wait," she whispered, without taking her eyes off her mother-in-law. Then she smiled. Not the polite, suffering smile she had worn all evening. No, this was a completely different smile. Slow, calm, almost tender. The smile of a boa constrictor looking at a doomed rabbit. She tilted her head slightly, studying her mother-in-law with curiosity, as if seeing her for the first time. There was no hatred in that smile. There was something worse. Cold, merciless superiority. She looked Vivian straight in the eyes and, in the ringing silence, clearly but softly, as if sharing an intimate secret, said just 2 words. "The loan is approved." If a grenade had exploded in the room, the effect would have been less devastating. Brooke's words weren't loud, but they hit Vivian's nervous system like an electric shock. First, total confusion crossed her face. What? What loan? This again? Then, as the meaning of each word sank in, her eyes widened. This was no hint anymore. It was a direct quote from the email subject line, an email that today only she and the bank manager had seen, and... Her gaze shot to the tablet lying on the coffee table, then back to her daughter-in-law's face, and in that moment, a horrifying, paralyzing realization hit her. This wasn't a bluff, not a guess. This creature, this quiet, smiling creature, knew everything. She had gone in. She had seen it. She knew the amount. She knew everything. And she had just detonated that bomb in front of her husband and her son. Vivian's psychological collapse took exactly 3 seconds. First second, the color drained from her face. Not just pale, deathly gray, like cheap paper. The triumphant grin slid off, leaving behind a twisted mask of terror. Second, her eyes, moments ago narrowed and vicious, flew wide open, turning into 2 dark voids filled with pure animal fear. Her mouth opened. She gasped for air, but couldn't make a sound, as if her vocal cords had been cut. Third second, the survival instinct, the primal one that makes an animal flee a burning forest, overpowered reason, pride, everything. She jumped up, not stood, but sprang up like she'd been stung, so abruptly that the heavy chair she'd been sitting on crashed backward into the wall. The noise was deafening. Joseph cried out. Russell staggered back. Vivian, seeing nothing in front of her, spun around and bolted out of the room. She didn't walk. She ran clumsily, stumbling, slamming her shoulder into the doorframe. She was no longer an icebreaker gliding through polar waters. She was a sinking ship, panicked, breaking apart. In the hallway, without turning on the light, she blindly yanked open the sliding closet door. The mirror reflected her distorted, unrecognizable face. Her hands fumbled, grabbing something soft and heavy, the fur coat, her fortress, her status, her armor. She ripped it off the hanger with such force that the wooden hanger cracked and fell to the floor with a pathetic clatter. Not putting it on, just clutching it in her arms, Pressing it to her chest like a lifeline, she rushed to the front door. Her trembling, disobedient fingers fumbled with the lock for several seconds. Finally, it clicked. The door flew open, and she burst onto the stairwell, into the dim light of the building, wrapped in her fur armor, clutching it tightly, almost barefoot, wearing only thin nylon stockings. The door slammed shut behind her, cutting her off from her former life. And in the hallway, on the doormat by the door, remained standing like two orphaned witnesses to her disgrace, her elegant suede boots with low heels, neat, expensive, absurd in their abandonment. Silence fell over the apartment, absolute, ringing silence, the kind that comes after an explosion when your ears are still buzzing and the air smells of smoke. Joseph was the first to come back to himself. He slowly, very slowly, lowered the fork that had frozen halfway to his mouth. The tart was forgotten. He looked at the overturned chair, at the empty space where his wife, his ruler, his center of the universe for 40 years, had just been sitting. Then he looked at his son. There was no longer fear or guilt in his eyes. There was horror. The horror of a man who suddenly realized he had lived his entire life with a stranger, that the wall of prosperity, success, and unshakable confidence he had been hiding behind was just cardboard scenery. He looked at Brooke. There was no judgment in his gaze, only a silent, desperate question. What? Russell, recovering from the initial shock, stepped toward Brooke. He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, not as a tired wife, not as an exhausted homemaker, not as his mother's victim, but as a stranger, incredibly strong, frightening, and mesmerizing. All his rage, all his helplessness, gone. Only shock remained, and the word lone ringing in his ears. Brooke, his voice was hoarse. What was that? She didn't answer right away. Calmly, she walked over to the table, picked up her almost untouched cup of cold tea, and took a small sip. Then she took her phone from her dress pocket, unlocked it, opened the archived chat, found the screenshot, and handed the phone to her husband. This, she said quietly. Russell took the phone. For several seconds, he stared at the screen, his eyes scanning the lines. Congratulations. Your loan in the amount of $85,000 has been approved. He reread the amount several times, as if he couldn't believe his eyes. $85,000. Consumer loan. The interest on those was brutal, and he knew perfectly well that their official family income, made up of his parents' pensions, could never support such a debt. It was a financial noose his mother had been preparing to throw around her own neck, her husband's, and maybe his. He handed the phone back to Brooke. His hands were slightly shaking. A house in the Hamptons, he whispered. A new crossover. Diversified portfolio, Brooke finished for him, without a trace of a smile. He looked at her, then at his father, who was sitting with his head in his hands, rocking gently. Then his gaze fell on the stack of money still lying on the tablecloth. $3,000. Alms. Against the backdrop of an $85,000 debt, the cash looked like mockery, like a cruel joke. Slowly, with a feeling close to disgust, he scooped the bills off the tablecloth, crushed them in his fist, and shoved them into his pants pocket. I'll give it back to him, he said dully. They didn't speak anymore. Dinner was over. The celebration was over too. Joseph stood up, not looking at anyone, and like a sleepwalker wandered into the hallway. He stopped in front of his wife's boots. He stared at them for a long time, like at a gravestone. Then, just as silently, he put on his own shoes and coat and left, quietly closing the door behind him. No goodbye. No, thank you for dinner. Nothing. Only a deafening silence. When the door closed behind him, Brooke and Russell were left alone in the middle of the wreckage. The overturned chair, dirty dishes, cold food, the crumpled money in her husband's pocket, and the lonely boots in the hallway. Russell walked over to Brooke and simply hugged her. Tightly, desperately, as if afraid she might dissolve into thin air. He buried his face in her hair and stood there for a long time, just breathing. "I'm sorry," he finally whispered. "I'm sorry I let this go on for so long. I was a coward." "You weren't a coward," Brooke replied, stroking his back. "You just loved your mom. And me? I was just tired." They stood there in the middle of their small living room, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like their home again, their fortress. A fortress that had withstood a siege. The next day passed in a strange, echoing haze. They cleared the table, washed the dishes, put the chair back in place. Life was returning to its usual rhythm, but something fundamental had changed. The air in the apartment felt different, cleaner, lighter. The invisible presence that had been pressing down, judging, was gone. Brooke woke up that morning with an incredible sense of lightness, as if a multi-ton weight she'd been carrying for years had been lifted from her shoulders. Vivian's phone was turned off. Russell called her number several times out of duty, not out of a desire to talk. There were no rings. Joseph didn't answer either. The call came the next day, after lunch. An unfamiliar number. Russell looked at Brooke. She nodded. "Answer it." It was Joseph, calling from a neighbor's phone at their country house. His voice was unrecognizable, quiet, hollow, drained of emotion. The voice of a man who had lived through a disaster. "Hello, son." "Hi, Dad. Are you okay?" Russell asked, though the answer was obvious. "No," his father said. "I wanted to ask, is it true about the loan?" It wasn't really a question. It was a statement that needed confirmation. "Yes, Dad. It's true." There was silence on the line. You could hear Joseph breathing heavily. She didn't tell me anything. She swore it was her old savings, investments." A bitter chuckle crept into his voice. "I found the papers in her jewelry box, the application, the preliminary agreement, $85,000. She wanted to buy the land in cash so it wouldn't be in my name. She would have told me it was a gift from some imaginary friend abroad." He went quiet again. "She's sleeping now. Took too many sedatives. I don't know what to do, Russell. I spent my whole life thinking we were one. And it turns out I was just furniture. Comfortable furniture." "Dad," Russell didn't know what to say. "Do you need help?" "No," Joseph said firmly, and for the first time there was steel in his voice. "We don't need help. I'll handle it myself. I just wanted you to know. And please pass my apologies to Brooke. For everything." He hung up without waiting for a response. Russell lowered the phone. Vivian's power, built on image, lies, and total control, hadn't collapsed in their apartment. It collapsed in the eyes of the one person whose absolute trust she had taken for granted and whom she had valued least. Her empire wasn't destroyed by her daughter-in-law. It was destroyed by her husband, who simply opened his eyes. That evening, Russell and Brooke stood in the hallway. On the floor, in the same spot, the suede boots were still standing. In 2 days, they had gathered a thin layer of dust and looked even more pitiful and abandoned. They were like a monument to a bygone era, an era of fear and humiliation. Russell silently bent down. He didn't pick them up. He took a large black trash bag from the shelf, opened it, and holding the boots with 2 fingers as if they were something dirty, dropped them inside with disgust. He tied the bag in a knot. Expensive suede, elegant design, a symbol of status. Now it was just trash wrapped in black plastic. He straightened up and looked at Brooke. His expression was serious and very grown up. "I'll take them tomorrow and leave them with the concierge in their building," he said. "Thank you." That "thank you" contained everything. Thanks for the dinner, for the patience, for the courage, but most of all, for freeing not just herself, but him as well. She had performed a painful but necessary surgery, removing a tumor that had been poisoning their lives. Brooke didn't reply. She just stepped closer, and rested her head on his shoulder. Their apartment was quiet now, and this silence was no longer a warning of a coming storm. It was the silence of peace, peace they had paid dearly for, but which now belonged only to them. The war was over. They had won.